You can listen again to any shows at bcfmradio.com. BCFM 93.2, your interactive station, 24 hours a day.
Well, the BBC Conspiracy Files is back. Did a Ukrainian fighter jet shoot down MH17? The BBC documentary claims a Boeing 777 may have been targeted by another plane. But these headlines, as usual, Martin, with the Conspiracy Files, and this chap, Mike Rudin, who we've had dealings with before, it's completely misleading because, of course, they tried to really just divert attention away from that possibility using this chap called Bellingcat.
Well, indeed, and you see, what they've got, this is so-called open source journalism. This guy, Bellingcat, as I understand it, was a redundant computer programmer, and he started going online every day in his house, looking at the kind of weaponry that was being used in the Syrian conflict, and then he just managed to leverage himself into being an expert on the Syrian conflict. It's a bit like the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is constantly quoted by the BBC. That's a guy working from his attic in Coventry of Syrian extraction.
Well, his name is Elliot Higgins.
Yeah. Oh, and Higgins is the Bellingcat guy. Yeah. Not the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, that's somebody else. Now, these people are then touted as independent journalists like me and thee, but in actual fact, they are mouthpieces for intelligence service propaganda, basically.
Have you got any evidence that he's not just who he says he is?
Well, no. Well, he can be who he says he is and still be an agent of influence. That's what he is. I think the MH17 stuff, we can go into detail on that. Do you know what? The Americans still haven't released their satellite reports. Kerry claimed that the satellites showed, without a doubt, that the attack was carried out by a Russian Buk missile. And the Russians said, well, come on then, show us your satellite reports. And they haven't, because you know why? Because they haven't got any. My best copper's hunch, having looked into it all, about what happened, is that it was shot down by a Ukrainian fighter jet, which various eyewitnesses said they'd seen, and they were actually interviewed by BBC Russia, and then the whole thing was suppressed.
Well, I've got something to add to that, because the very footage you're talking about, yes, it was disappeared by BBC. I think it's called BBC World Service that looks after that. It's part of their budget that does BBC Russia. The individual reporter had her report taken off the BBC website just a few days after it was broadcast, and it's all in Russian with I think she's a former Latvian reporter. Yeah. And the eyewitnesses were saying, "Oh yeah, we saw a fighter jet chasing this plane." Not only that, is I thought I'd give it a go, and so I put that particular bit of footage this week up on YouTube. Guess what? BBC World have ordered it to be taken down.
Well, what a surprise! Now, there are other...
most of the rest of the world, you can watch this stuff, but not in Britain. Wonder what's going on there?
Well, because just like the fact that we started the war in Syria, that we carried out the sarin attack at Ghouta, and that we shot down MH17, we are the fascist barbarians.
Our licence fee pays money. Actually, no, I think BBC World is paid for out of the Foreign Office, although I'm not sure, it may be now licence fee that the government have forced them to use the licence fee to pay for that, is being used to issue legal notices to take down factual stuff the BBC have gone out and shot, because it's embarrassing to them to see that their own footage is not being used by the Conspiracy Files programme. So that seems incredible to me. The BBC have got this explosive footage of their own, and yet they don't show it in their own documentary.
Well, I mean, we're being manipulated. To carry out a thought experiment. If there really is a criminal oligarchy in charge with gangsters and Secret Service agents running around the place trying to fix everything, you can be pretty sure they're trying to fix the media while they're on.
Well, the absolute top-notch site on Bellingcat is Wikispooks. So if you go along to wikispooks.com/wiki/Bellingcat, you'll find a fantastic amount of information about him. I mean, for example, on 23rd of August 2014, Bellingcat made an estimate of the exact location where the James Foley ISIS execution video was made, and yet he failed to notice the video itself was fake.
Well, there you go. I mean, what we've got... I mean, a key component in all of this is Rita Katz's website, searching internet for terrorist entities. And she's the one that's broken a lot of these ISIS videos. You wonder, why does she get hold of all their videos first? Extraordinary. And ISIS seems to have a very, very kind of savvy media arm. They've got their own monthly glossy magazine, which you can actually read online.
And the evidence presented in the programme didn't include some of the most explosive evidence. It's not on July the 19th, Kiev's security service, this is just after the downing of the airliner, the SBU published photos online that it claimed showed Russia secretly withdrawing a Buk stroke M surface-to-air missile system from the Ukraine civil war zone. However, bloggers immediately pointed out the photos were of a Kiev air defence system.
Well, the fact of the matter is that the only Buk air defence systems in the area were those of the Ukrainian military. The Russian military. Don't forget the Russian rebels. The rebels in Donbass and Luhansk are basically a dad's army militia. They wouldn't know how to fire one of these complex pieces of equipment, even if they had one.
Now, I noticed also that there was no particular producer that actually. Mike Rudin had done the entire programme himself, written, directed it and everything, and there wasn't an actual reporter on screen. For these conspiracy file programmes, they don't seem to like the idea of using a reporter. Now, from a professional journalistic point of view, this is an absolute no-no. You don't have a mystery person behind the scenes whose name you can only see in the credits. In fact, what he did is he used the actress Caroline Katz, who's a drama actress, to do all the voicing. There was actually no professional journalistic side to that at all.
And she's got the same surname as Rita Katz.
Yes, spelled with a C though, not a K.
Ah, okay.
Anyway, so she's an actress doing a documentary. Yeah. What on earth is this? It almost sounds, if you start to drill into it, it almost looks as if this is blatant manipulation.
Well, what it is they are worried by the existence of things like Russia Today, where all of the issues that we talk about are discussed openly in a rational way. That starts to undermine their power.
And what about
the BBC's role is to spread as much smoke and mirrors as possible.
Never even mentioned, as well as these interviews the BBC themselves had in their archives, still have, I imagine, unless they've been destroyed, it is the tapes of the air traffic control, because this plane was mysteriously diverted downwards and towards the war zone by Kiev air traffic control. Then, I suppose one of the big smoking guns for me is they interviewed Yatsenyuk, who's the president of Ukraine. One of the questions...
Prime Minister. Prime Minister.
Prime Minister, yeah. And one of the questions that the families of the victims of that airliner desperately want asked is why, 3 weeks after that disaster, was the Defence Minister, Andrei Paribi, mysteriously sacked by him? No question was even asked of the Prime Minister. What was all that about? Because many of the families are looking at that and thinking, that's rather suspicious. Why did you sack your Defence Minister without any explanation? In fact, he himself said, I'm not going to say why I've been removed, and he's now Speaker of the Ukrainian Parliament, Paribi.
Yeah, well, the other thing I'd mention to add to that is that the black boxes were recovered by, in the areas controlled by the rebels, and they were passed to Moscow and then passed to the British, and then they've disappeared.
Well,
Nobody
the British
knows
have still got them. There hasn't been any proper report, or certainly something that's able to be peer-reviewed. The other thing to point out about Paribi, of course, is he's a neo-Nazi.
Yes, well, he's recently been in Canada and in the US canvassing support. He is a neo-Nazi, and he looks as if he was behind the Odessa Trade Union Hall massacre, etc. But these people are working in cahoots with our intelligence services, so let it not be forgotten, we now have evidence we're involved in gassing civilians at Ghouta in order to try and win their war that they started in Syria. These people are not nice people, but they're paid for by our taxes, and at what point are we going to do something about it?
Well, good question. Overall, the Conspiracy Files has looked at all sorts of things, 7/7, 9/11 several times, the death of Princess Diana. It does look as if the whole idea of having kind of balanced documentaries is completely out of the window. Is there anything we could do about people like Mike Rudin, apart from, I've had conversations with him, phoned him up at the BBC and said, basically, what the hell do you think you're doing, putting out this propaganda? Is there anything we can do to bring back a kind of golden age of balanced journalism? Because it almost looks as if these big TV networks are now being used to each one only shows its own side of the story.
Well, the fact is that there's two sides to this. Yes, this kind of manipulation is becoming more and more egregious, but the fact is that it can also be exposed, and it could well be that if we get the exposure right and in the right kind of and the balls line up, that all these scams that they've been engaged in will come back to bite them in the bum. That's my hope.
One place that this documentary is certainly not going to go down well is in Holland, because they actually recently had a referendum of some sort, didn't they? A vote on whether to to rubber stamp the some sort. What is this agreement?
There's an accession agreement between the Ukraine and the EU. It's not. There's no promise that they should join the EU because it's actually virtually impossible to imagine how you can arrange it. Integrating Greece has turned out to be quite a difficulty. Integrating the Ukraine is completely bonkers. But it's actually very disadvantageous.
What about Turkey?
Well, yes, that includes Kurdistan, of course, so we'll just have all the Kurds as well, at least for the time being. We go around the world setting off these bombs politically and socially, and then we want to come home and have a nice cup of tea. And I'm afraid that's not the way the world works. I often say to people who supported the war in Iraq in 2003, you said you wanted it. Now you're going to pay for it.
Much was made in the documentary the fact that this Su-25 fighter, which some are saying could have actually fired a missile from it, an air-to-air missile, to bring down the plane or hit it with its cannon. It's got a powerful cannon which could have been aimed at the cockpit. In fact, many people have pointed to holes in the wreckage, saying actually that does look like a cannon has been fired into the cockpit by another aircraft. Much was made in the documentary that this plane can barely reach that altitude, but we've got two other potential bits of evidence which weren't explored by Mike Rudin. One is the possibility, well, first of all, the fact that the air traffic control ordered the plane to come down, so it may be that they were already at that stage thinking about trying to shoot the thing down. It actually did move down, and it moved closer. And also, of course, there's a very, very basic thing that they didn't even consider, and that is that it's possible that the plane was a little bit lower, maybe 1,000 feet higher as an airliner, and it fired at it from there.
Well, indeed, that's quite right.
A missile can easily
also
do that.
the other smoking gun is that they haven't followed normal procedure in the investigation.
Indeed, they haven't, have they?
They've just made it up as they went along from the get-go, and they've even signed an agreement with the Kiev government that nobody's going to agree what the story is about what happened unless everybody agrees, including the government in Kiev, who are in fact suspects.
Okay, so nothing's going to come out. Those poor families, honestly, it really is a hideous. The other thing that happened, I don't know if you know about this, but the pilot's body, when it was brought back to delivered back to Malaysia, a deal was done where it was said, okay, you're not allowed to say anything without our permission, then we'll give you the body back. I mean,
but they were also allowed to carry out a post-mortem on the body. They weren't allowed to do that because, of course, what that shows probably is that the guy was shot.
You mean with cannon shells from the aircraft? Goodness gracious. Anyway, horrendous to think that this sort of stuff is still put out on the BBC, that Mike Rudin still got his job. Absolutely amazing when we consider that the brilliant documentary tradition we've had over the years in this country at looking at both sides. I mean, he really is taking the mickey, that chap. So let's move on now, Mark, just look at the thing I mentioned at the top of the hour, which is the trade union bill. This is rather an attack on trade unionism.